Yeah, so my paper is going to be entitled "Putting Maguey on the Map: The Cultural Geography of the Pulque Trade in Early Colonial Mexico." This is based off a chapter from my thesis, which I'm currently finishing at the moment, which, as an overall kind of work, looks more broadly at issues of indigenous negotiation and agency in the early colonial pulque trade. I will explain what pulque is in a minute. I know it's not a familiar term for everyone. So, I mean, first of all, I am going to start with explaining what pulque is. And then we're going to have sort of a really, really brief crash course of what the colonial context is for the aspects that I'm going to be talking about. And this will be really, really brief introduction to Mexico in the 16th and 17th century. I'll move on to talk about mapping trade pathways, the geographical spread of the pulque trade, and why we should care about this as, historians of intoxicants, or for me, historians of colonial regimes. I'll talk about Mexico City, the idea of its being a center of pulque commerce, and how looking at production rather than consumption challenges our conception of this. And then I'm going to finish by talking a bit about regional trade and trade networks between Mexico City and rural settlements. So pulque is about as traditional as an intoxicant as you can get. We have archaeological evidence of pulque making in Mexico dating back around 2,000 years. And it's an alcoholic drink that's produced by fermenting the sap of the maguey plant. And maguey is a term that encompasses various types of agave. I've got the most important ones up on the slide here. So because its fermentation process is continual and quite rapid, it's got a very short shelf life. It lasts about 24 to 48 hours after the fermentation's taken place to turn the sap into the drink. I'll zip here. I've got some pictures. On the right, the bowl with sort of the milky white substance in, that's pulque. We've got on the top left, these are maguey plants. You can see they grow to a pretty big size. And below that is the cavity in the plant, which you scrape to induce the sap to flow out. And prior to the Spanish conquest in 1521, pulque is consumed both in the context of religious ceremony, and it's consumed communally to mark important social occasions. So, for instance, a marriage or the birth of a child. This is all very much in line with beliefs about moderate drinking and balance, with a focus on the idea of drunkenness being inappropriate and potentially dangerous outside a prescribed ritual context. So, although we have this idea of pulque being a ritual beverage in some way, it is still also a commercial product before the conquest, and there are people who work as pulque makers and traders full time. It's a recognized profession. But from this, the trade expands massively during the 16th and 17th century. And in this presentation, I'm mainly going to be talking about pulque trading among Nahua peoples, so indigenous peoples of central Mexico who speak the Nahuatl language. But these are far from the only cultures to make pulque. There is a huge tradition in Oaxaca amongst Mixtec and Zapotec people, and the Otomi in northern central Mexico are also known for their pulque making. So, I mean, I've got quite a bit of history to cover in a very short time here. I've only got time for a very brief overview, but hopefully this will give some context for explaining why patterns develop as they do in the trade. So the Spanish invade Mexico in 1519, and in 1521, the Mexica Empire, the Aztec as we often know them, the empire collapses and Mexico becomes the colony of New Spain. It stays this way for 300 years. and the existing capital, Tenochtitlan, becomes Mexico City, the capital of the colony. Initially, the government displays very little concern regarding Pulque until the late 16th century. By this point, Mexico is a fairly mature colony, and there's now space to focus on threats to colonial control, which had initially been considered quite minor. So the overriding concern in the early years was on things like consolidating institutions of government and on the evangelization process. The colonial government attempts to ban pulque completely in 1570, only to then re-legalize the drink in 1608. And throughout the period of the ban, there's evidence that maguey cultivation increased. There is a roaring trade in aguamiel, which is the sap before it's fermented. And we've got various reports that people are still making pulque even though it's banned. And eventually the colonial government has to admit defeat, and the trade is legalized only for indigenous peoples in 1608. And even before the measure where it's restricted to indigenous peoples, these are the primary participants in the trade. And so the development and the expansion of these pulque trade networks takes place in the context of an administration that at the very best is ambivalent towards pulque trading, and at the worst, it's actively hostile. I'm going to go and talk a little bit about mapping the trade pathways in pulque. And I've done this by looking at there are two key areas that I'm interested in. So there's cultivation of maguey plants, which generally indicates, if it's on a considerable scale, that there is a culture of pulque making in that particular area. And I focus on records of pulque production and sale. To do this, I've relied on three key areas of sources. The first is a collection of documents that we call the Relaciones Geográficas. These are essentially questionnaires that are sent out to indigenous towns in the areas that are further away from Mexico City. It's supposed to be sent to Spain so that the king can be better informed of the customs and the ways of living of his. By this point, they're not especially new subjects. The Relaciones are conducted between 1579 and 1582. But up until this point, there has not been this kind of large-scale inquiry into daily living. And these are useful for me because they record a lot of maguey agriculture, and they record industries going on in towns that are reliant on the plant. For instance, syrup making from maguey is quite popular. I've also looked at wills left by indigenous testators, and from these we can see that maguey plants are a very common thing to bequeath to others in wills, a pretty prominent sign that these are objects of real value in native communities. And I've relied a lot on court records, so petitions that were brought by pulque producers to the Audiencia, the appellate court in Mexico City. And I guess the issue now is, why should we care about what the geographical spread or how these trade networks functioned? And it's because trade patterns in pulque commerce also map to a great extent adaptation to how this business has to function under a colonial system, or ways in which participation in this trade actually challenges colonial rule. And when I say challenge, I mean that it forces certain accommodations on the part of the colonial administration which would not otherwise have been made. It's not a direct challenge to the legitimacy of Spanish rule. And mapping tells us a few other things. I mean, to begin with, the spread demonstrates clearly the success of indigenous peoples in pulque commerce. It shows that the later patterning of the trade, at which point it's largely dominated by Spanish and Creole landowners, It shows that this patterning is really based off a much earlier indigenous template. And it shows Pulque traders as active and mobile agents who constructed a very extensive and quite complex trade network. And in a way, it helps us to contextualize the attitude of the colonial government towards pulque. Why were they so very worried about this drink? And part of this is to do with the fact that the trade is very widespread and it becomes a key industry in so many communities all across central Mexico. So I'm gonna show some maps now, and bear with me, because one thing I've just discovered is that I haven't indicated the actual size of Mexico City at this point. So I'll explain as we come along, but some of the maps may look a little different. So I start off with the bigger maps just to give a sense of where the region that we're talking about is situated in Mexico. And it is very central. In the 1570s and 80s, you have a little bit more of a wider spread. So there's maguey cultivation in Veracruz on the Caribbean coast and in Guerrero on the Pacific. That's not so much the case when we get into the late 1500s into mid 17th century. We see a much more intensive cluster around the central region and particularly surrounding Mexico City. And we see, there's a little bit more variation, a wider spread again into the mid to late 17th century, but still, once again, very much the region surrounding the city. And I've highlighted in the smaller maps, what I'm going to talk about is the eastern jurisdictions. And these are areas where the pulque trade functions completely independently of Mexico City, mainly around the cities of Puebla and of Tlaxcala. And the problem I was going to explain about the map is that where it says Mexico City here is a much larger area than it was at the time. There are so many towns that have been absorbed into Mexico City that really we're looking about Mexico City being possibly just one little area in the middle. All of this we're looking at is areas that are much further north or areas that are now neighborhoods. And the circle here, we've got, it corresponds to a law that was introduced trying to restrict the trade to 5 leagues within the city. And the response to that was quite enthusiastic. You can see a clustering of trade within that. And it's because the trade offers certain protections to people bringing in pulque from those areas. So in the historiography, we've tended to think about Mexico City as the center of the pulque trade. And this is because we've always talked much more about consumption than we have about production. So Mexico City is the most populous city in New Spain at the time. And by 1644, there's an approximate indigenous population of around 20,000. And because Mexico City is also home to the highest number of pulque taverns, pulquerias, when we talk about intoxicating space in reference to Mexico City, we've tended to focus on these taverns as spaces of consumption. But I'm much more interested in spaces of production and spatial geographies that make intoxication in the tavern possible. So when we look at production, we find that Mexico City is far, far less important. Almost all of the pulque that enters the city comes in from more rural settlements, either surrounding it, as in the cases of towns like Coyoacán or Tacubaya, which are now neighborhoods of Mexico City. And even from much further afield, we have instances in the records of traders traveling 40, 45 miles in from places like Tolcayuca in Hidalgo. So we have the idea of a city as an attractive pulque market, as a key space for sale and consumption, but not so much for production. And if we're only looking at the pulqueria, our understanding of the way in which cities depend very heavily on these rural maguey growing areas remains very incomplete. So, although pulque taverns were largely an urban phenomenon, the pulque trade as a whole is not, because it relies very heavily on this rural production and constant flow of product into the city. And in recognizing the importance and the really wide distribution of rural production, I'm hoping that this also shows that the pulque trade has very great potential as a lens through which to examine social life and responses to colonial change, because it is an aspect of social life that is prominent in so many communities. And I'm going to finish just in my last bit. I hope I'm keeping to time. Talking a little bit about regional and rural urban trade networks. So there is a real increase in regional trade outside Mexico City, even as the population of the city and demand for pulque grows. I'm just going to quickly click back to one of my maps. So if you'll see, we've got quite a few points coming up as areas of production and sale, even far outside Mexico City. And this is not always because it's geographically inconvenient to go to the city. In a lot of cases, traders do just genuinely choose to pursue regional and local trade. We have records of people who only sell within the markets of their jurisdiction, so within about a 10-kilometer radius. And we have people who produce and sell completely from their homes, and the customers will come to them and be served. And so you have these smaller independent pulque economies that develop independently of Mexico City, which is again lending weight to the idea that we need to look away from the city, or at least not focus so heavily on it, in order to get a more complete picture of trade. And you have very extensive trade networks created between Mexico City and between more outlying regions. So we're talking about really states that are much farther north, like Hidalgo, like the northern regions of what's now the state of Mexico. But the existence and the success of local pulque economies mean that rural producers are never entirely dependent on the Mexico City pulque market, although the reverse isn't true, because without the constant influx of these rural producers, really you don't have a pulque market in Mexico City at all. And I suppose I just want to wrap up by making a link back to the theme of the conference, to the theme of intoxicating spaces. And what I'm trying to get across here, I suppose, is that an intoxicating space is not just the space where the intoxicant is consumed, it's the spaces of production, the spaces of transport, and the spaces of sale that enable the intoxicant to reach the consumer in the first place. And in our sessions yesterday, we already had some really excellent papers on how intoxicants have been used to support narratives of colonial superiority and exploitation. And I hope I've been able to suggest ways in which the geographical expansion and proliferation of intoxicant commerce was sometimes also firmly in the interests of the colonized, since these people are, the primary movers, the primary architects of these forms of commerce and of these trade pathways. So thank you very much for listening. I look forward to your questions.